Hello, and welcome back to WisdomLoom English. Before we start, answer one question honestly. What is the one thing you wanted to do this year, but never did? A conversation you never started, a job you never applied for, a skill you never tried to learn. Now ask yourself why. Most of the time, the honest answer is not, I couldn't. The honest answer is, I was afraid. Fear has a strange power. It never touches your body, yet it controls your choices. It never physically blocks your path, yet it convinces you the path is blocked. It has no weight, no shape, no substance you can hold in your hand, and still it manages to stop capable, intelligent, talented people from ever taking the first step toward the life they actually want. Somewhere right now, someone is not sending an important email because of fear. Someone is not walking into an interview because of fear. Someone is not speaking a single sentence in English out loud because of fear. None of these people lack ability. They are simply standing in front of something that looks far more dangerous than it actually is. Today, we are going to look closely at this invisible force, understand where it really comes from, and learn exactly how ordinary people no different from you, learn to walk past it instead of being ruled by it. We will talk about why fear feels so much larger inside your head than it ever is in real life. We will talk about how attention feeds fear the same way fuel feeds a fire. We will talk about the stories your mind quietly writes and hands to you as if they were facts. And by the end, we will talk about the one decision that actually breaks fear's grip. A decision so simple that most people overlook it completely. None of what follows requires you to become a different person overnight. It only asks you to see fear a little more clearly than you have before. Stay until the end, because the final idea in this video is the one that changes everything. Let's begin. Lesson 1. Fear looks bigger than it is. Picture a street lamp at night and a small dog standing beside it. Look at the ground and you will see something strange. The dog's shadow stretches across the pavement, tall and stretched, almost the size of a wolf. Nothing about the dog has changed, only the angle of the light has changed. This is exactly how fear behaves inside the human mind. It takes something small, something manageable, and stretches it until it looks impossible to face. Think of someone who has never spoken English out loud in front of another person. Long before they open their mouth, a voice inside starts working against them. You will forget the words. Your accent will sound wrong. People will notice every mistake. None of this has happened yet. It is a shadow cast by imagination, not a report from reality. Yet the person reacts as if it were already true. Their hands become cold. Their throat tightens. They decide silence is safer than speaking. This pattern repeats in every corner of life. A student wants to raise their hand in class, but pictures the whole room laughing. An employee wants to ask for a raise, but pictures instant rejection. A person wants to send the first message, but pictures being ignored. In almost every case, the fear arrives fully formed before a single fact has been gathered. The mind writes the ending before the story has even started. Here is something worth noticing. Try to remember a moment when you were terrified of something that never actually happened the way you imagined. Maybe you feared a difficult conversation for a week, only to have it end calmly in 10 minutes. Maybe you feared a test result for days, and when it arrived, it was nothing close to the disaster you had rehearsed in your head. If you search your memory honestly, you will find dozens of these moments. The fear was loud. The outcome was quiet. This does not mean fear is always wrong to feel. Real fear exists for good reasons. If you step too close to a cliff edge, fear pulls you back, and that reaction can save your life. But most of the fear people carry every day is not that kind. It is not protecting you from a cliff. It is protecting you from discomfort, from the small sting of being seen trying and possibly failing. And that kind of fear, the psychological kind, grows almost entirely inside the mind rather than out in the world. It helps to separate these two categories clearly, because treating them as the same thing is where most of the trouble begins. Physical fear is immediate, specific, and usually resolves quickly once the danger passes. Psychological fear, on the other hand, can stretch across weeks or months, attaching itself to situations that pose no real threat to your safety at all, only to your comfort or your self-image. A wild animal does not spend 3 days anxious about a threat that has not yet appeared. Human beings, uniquely, are capable of suffering in advance, sometimes suffering more from the anticipation of an event than they ever would have suffered from the event itself. Recognizing which category of fear belongs to, physical or psychological, is often the first and most useful step in deciding how much weight that fear actually deserves. There is a simple way to test any fear before you let it decide something for you. Ask yourself 3 questions. What exactly am I afraid will happen? What proof do I actually have that this will happen? And if the worst version did happen, could I recover from it? Walk through these questions slowly the next time fear rises, and you will often notice the fear shrinking right in front of you, the same way a shadow shrinks the moment you turn on a brighter light. People who eventually build the life they want are rarely people who stopped feeling afraid. They are people who stopped trusting every frightening thought their mind produced. They learn to separate the shadow from the object casting it. And once you learn to see that difference clearly, fear no longer gets to make your decisions for you without being questioned first. Think about a child learning to swim. Standing at the edge of the pool, the water below can look endless and dangerous, even if it is only waist deep for an adult. The child's fear is not dishonest. It is simply uninformed. It has no experience to measure the water against, so it assumes the worst possible depth, the worst possible outcome. The moment the child actually steps in and feels solid ground beneath their feet, the fear collapses almost instantly, not because the water changed, but because imagination met reality, and reality turned out to be far more manageable. Adults experience the exact same pattern, just with more sophisticated fears. A person hesitating to change careers imagines financial ruin, judgment from family, and years of struggle, often without a single conversation to check whether any of that is realistic. A person afraid to end an unhealthy relationship imagines loneliness stretching endlessly into the future, without ever testing whether that loneliness would actually last, or whether it would fade the way most transitions eventually do. The mind, left unchecked, almost always reaches for the most dramatic outcome available, because dramatic outcomes feel urgent, and urgency feels important enough to obey. Here is a practical exercise worth trying this week. The next time you notice fear rising before something you want to do, write down exactly what you are afraid will happen, in specific detail. Then write down, just as specifically, what you would actually do if that exact outcome occurred. In almost every case, you will discover you already have a plan, a way forward, a next move. The fear was pretending to be a wall, but once examined closely, it usually turns out to be nothing more than a doorway with a strange shadow falling across it. Lesson 2. What you keep watching keeps growing. There is an old habit among photographers. If you want an object to look larger in a photo, You do not need to change the object. You simply move the camera closer to it. Suddenly, a small stone can fill the entire frame and look like a boulder. Attention works exactly the same way inside the mind. Whatever you keep looking at keeps expanding, whether or not it deserves that much space. Consider two people preparing for the same job interview. The first spends the night before replaying every way it could go wrong. What if I freeze? What if they ask something I can't answer? What if I say something foolish? By morning, that person has rehearsed failure so many times that failure feels like the only realistic outcome. The second person also feels nervous, but instead of replaying disasters, they spend that same time reviewing what they actually know, preparing a few honest answers, and picturing themselves speaking clearly. Same event, same nervous system, completely different emotional experience, because they pointed their attention in a different direction. This is one of the quiet secrets behind people who seem unusually calm under pressure. They are not calm because nothing scares them. They are calm because they have trained themselves not to feed every frightening thought with more thinking time. Every time you replay a worst-case scenario in detail, you are not preparing yourself. You are rehearsing fear until it feels like memory. It is worth understanding why this happens on a deeper level. The mind does not always distinguish clearly between something imagined vividly and something actually experienced. When you replay a feared conversation in your head over and over, your body often responds with the same racing heart and tight chest it would produce during the real event. In effect, you can suffer through a difficult moment dozens of times before it ever actually happens. And then, exhausted from all that imagined suffering, you may still have to face the real moment on top of it. This is an enormous, unnecessary cost, paid entirely in advance, for an event that may not even unfold the way you rehearsed it. Think of fear like a small flame in the dark. Left alone, a small flame stays small. But keep adding fuel to it, one anxious thought after another, one imagined failure after another, and eventually, it becomes a fire large enough to keep you from moving at all. The fix is rarely to fight the fire directly. The fix is to stop supplying it with fuel. Instead of asking what could go wrong, try asking, what is the next honest step I can take right now? That single shift in the question changes where your energy goes. This matters enormously for anyone learning a new skill, including a new language. Many learners spend far more hours worrying about their mistakes than they spend actually practicing. They replay the moment they mispronounced a word. They imagine everyone remembering it. Meanwhile, a learner who focuses on communication instead of perfection keeps talking, keeps improving, and slowly the fear that once felt enormous becomes background noise instead of the main event. There is a simple redirection technique worth practicing. The next time you notice your attention pouring itself entirely into a feared outcome, pause and physically shift your focus onto something concrete and useful. One small preparation step you could take in the next 5 minutes. Write one sentence you might say. Review one fact you already know well. Send one message that moves things forward slightly. This is not about ignoring the fear or pretending it does not exist. It is about refusing to let it be the only thing occupying your attention. Because attention, once spent, cannot also be spent building the very readiness that would make the feared outcome less likely in the first place. Guard your attention the way you would guard something valuable, because that is exactly what it is. Every hour spent staring at imagined failure is an hour not spent building the skill, the courage, or the relationship you actually want. Point your attention toward the next useful action, and you will find that fear, deprived of fuel, naturally begins to shrink on its own. There is a useful comparison here to how a garden grows. A gardener does not water every seed equally. They give attention to the plants they want to flourish, and they pull out the weeds before those weeds take over the soil. Your mind works in a similar way, except most people never learn to weed it. They allow fearful thoughts to sit there, unchallenged, taking up space and nutrients that could have gone towards something far more useful. Learning to notice a fearful thought and simply choose not to water it is one of the most underrated skills a person can develop. Notice also how fear tends to multiply when it is discussed with the wrong company. Surround yourself with people who constantly discuss everything that could go wrong, and you will start to see danger everywhere too, even in situations that were originally quite safe. Surround yourself instead with people who focus on solutions, on next steps, on what is actually possible, and your own attention naturally begins shifting in that same direction. This is not about ignoring real risks. It is about recognizing that constant exposure to fearful conversation acts exactly like fuel on a fire, whether that fire is your own or someone else's. A simple nightly habit can help retrain this pattern. Before sleeping, instead of reviewing everything that worried you during the day, try reviewing one thing you handled well, no matter how small. This trains your attention to notice capability instead of danger, and over weeks, that repeated practice quietly rewires which stories your mind reaches for first, the next time something uncertain appears in front of you. Lesson 3. Fear is a story, not always a fact. The same event can produce two completely different feelings, depending on the story a person tells themselves about it. This is one of the most important things to understand about fear, because it means fear is often manufactured by interpretation, not delivered directly by reality. Imagine you send a message to a friend, and an hour passes without a reply. One story says, "They are busy, they will answer soon." Another story says, "I said something wrong, they are upset with me." Nothing about the silence has changed. Only the story wrapped around that silence has changed. And yet one story leaves you calm, while the other leaves you anxious for the rest of the day. The mind is remarkably fast at constructing these stories, and it tends to lean toward the darkest version available. This likely comes from something ancient in human wiring, a habit built for a world full of physical danger, where assuming the worst kept our ancestors alive. But in modern daily life, that same habit often produces unnecessary suffering rather than protection. It assumes rejection before anyone has rejected you. It assumes failure before you have even attempted anything. But there is real freedom in learning to pause and ask, is this the only possible explanation? Or is this simply the explanation my anxious mind reached for first? Very often, when you search for alternative explanations, you find several that are just as likely, and usually far less frightening, than the one fear offered first. Desire plays a role here too. The more intensely you want something, the more threatening its loss can feel. A person who deeply wants to be respected will feel sharp fear at the thought of criticism. A person who deeply wants security will feel sharp fear at the thought of change. This does not mean you should want less. It means recognizing that the fear is often proportional to the attachment, not to the actual danger involved. There is a helpful distinction between holding a goal firmly and holding it desperately. A firm goal says, "I want this outcome, and I will work hard toward it." A desperate goal says, "My entire worth depends on this outcome, and I cannot survive without it." The first version allows for setbacks, adjustments, and even occasional failure without collapsing a person's sense of self. The second version turns every uncertain moment into an emergency because so much has been placed on a single result. Loosening that grip, just slightly, moving from desperate to firm, often reduces fear dramatically, not by wanting the goal any less, but by no longer treating its absence as catastrophic. Picture walking into an unfamiliar room at night and noticing an unusual shape in the corner. For a moment, your mind may construct something alarming. Then you find the light switch, and the shape turns out to be nothing more than a coat hung over a chair. The object in the room never changed. Only your understanding of it changed. And with that understanding, the fear disappeared instantly. Most of the fears people carry through daily life work exactly this way. They do not need to be defeated through force. They need to be examined in better light. Consider how differently the same silence can be interpreted, depending on someone's mood that day. On a confident day, an unanswered message barely registers. On an insecure day, that same unanswered message can spiral into an entire imagined story about being unwanted or forgotten. The external event was identical in both cases. Only the internal state supplying the interpretation had changed. This tells us something important. Fear is often less about what is happening and more about which lens we happen to be looking through in that particular moment. It helps to remember that the mind is not trying to deceive you out of malice. It is trying to protect you using an old, blunt instrument built for a much simpler and more physically dangerous world. That instrument is not well suited for modern situations like public speaking, job applications, or difficult conversations, yet it still activates with the same intensity it once reserved for genuine physical threats. Recognizing this can create a small but powerful shift, because once you see fear as an overreacting but well-meaning alarm system, rather than a reliable narrator of truth, you stop needing to obey it automatically. A helpful practice is to write down the fearful story your mind offers. Then deliberately write 2 or 3 alternative explanations beside it. If a friend seems distant, one alternative might be that they are simply overwhelmed with their own responsibilities. Another might be that they did not notice the message at all. Seeing multiple explanations laid out side by side weakens the grip of the single dark story fear initially offered, and it reminds you that certainty about the worst outcome was never actually available in the first place. Lesson 4. You are not the fear you feel. There is a quiet trap many people fall into without noticing. They begin by saying, "I feel nervous," and over time, this slowly turns into, "I am a nervous person." The first sentence describes a passing feeling. The second sentence describes an identity, and once fear becomes part of how someone describes themselves, it becomes far harder to walk away from. Think of weather passing over a mountain. Some days bring storms. Some days bring clear skies. The mountain itself never changes shape because of the weather. It simply stands there while conditions move around it. You are far more like that mountain than you are like any single storm that passes over you. Fear is weather. It arrives, it does its work, and eventually it moves on. It was never meant to be a permanent description of who you are. This distinction matters because identity shapes future behavior in a powerful way. If someone quietly decides, "I am not a confident speaker," they will begin avoiding situations that require speaking, and every avoided situation will feel like further proof that the label was correct. The label creates the behavior, and the behavior confirms the label. It becomes a closed loop that gets harder to escape the longer it continues. Breaking that loop usually starts with a single act that contradicts the label. however small. A person who believes I am not a confident speaker does not need to deliver a flawless speech to challenge that belief. They only need to say one honest sentence out loud in a real conversation and notice that the world did not end. That single piece of contrary evidence is often enough to put a small crack in a belief that had felt permanent for years. Beliefs built slowly through repeated avoidance can also be loosened slowly through repeated small actions that quietly disagree with them. The way out starts with language. Instead of saying, I am afraid, try saying, I notice fear right now. That small change creates distance between you and the emotion. It reminds you that you are the one observing the fear, not the fear itself. A person who notices anger is not the same as a person who becomes anger. The same separation applies to fear, and that separation is where choice becomes possible again. Even people widely admired for their courage still feel fear regularly. Performers feel it before walking on stage. Athletes feel it before a difficult competition. What separates them is not the absence of the feeling, but the refusal to let the feeling write the final sentence. They allow themselves to feel afraid and act anyway. And over time, that pattern becomes their actual identity, not the fear itself. Consider how strange it would sound if someone said, I felt sick yesterday, therefore I am a sick person forever. Everyone would recognize immediately that an illness is a temporary condition, not a permanent identity, and that it will pass with time and proper care. Yet people apply exactly this flawed logic to fear constantly, treating one anxious afternoon as proof of a fixed personality trait rather than simply a passing state. Practicing the same clear thinking with emotional states as you would with physical ones can dissolve a surprising amount of unnecessary self-limitation. Look back at something that terrified you years ago and no longer does. That change alone proves fear is temporary and shifting rather than a fixed part of who you are. Whatever frightens you today may look completely different a year from now, especially if you keep choosing to act rather than retreat. There is also a subtle danger in letting other people's labels become your identity as well. A single harsh comment from a teacher, a parent, or a classmate years ago, "You're too quiet, you're not a natural speaker," can quietly settle into someone's self-image and stay there for decades, repeated to themselves long after the person who said it has forgotten the moment entirely. It is worth asking, honestly, which of your current self-descriptions actually came from your own considered judgment, and which ones were simply handed to you once, long ago, by someone else's passing comment. Language itself offers a powerful tool for loosening these old labels. Try this small shift the next time an old fear-based label appears in your thinking. Instead of silently accepting, "I am not good at this," try saying out loud or in your mind, "I have not practiced this enough yet." The first sentence closes a door permanently. The second sentence leaves it open, because it correctly identifies the real issue, which is usually a lack of repetition rather than a lack of fundamental ability. Skill almost always follows repetition, and repetition is available to nearly everyone willing to keep showing up. Athletes and performers often describe a technique of separating their nervous body from their capable mind right before a big moment. They notice the racing heart, the tight chest, the shaking hands, and instead of interpreting these signals as proof that something is wrong, they simply name them. This is my body preparing for something important. That single reframe, physical excitement rather than danger, changes almost nothing physically, and yet changes everything about how the moment feels and how a person is able to act within it. Lesson 5. Do not let fear design your whole life. There is a particular kind of regret that tends to arrive quietly, often much later than expected. It rarely comes from things that were attempted and failed. It usually comes from things that were never attempted at all. The conversation never had. The opportunity never taken. The version of life never given a real chance. Fear rarely announces itself honestly. It almost never says, "I am the reason you are staying still." Instead, it disguises itself as patience. Wait until you feel more ready. Wait until conditions improve. Wait until you feel more confident. These sound like careful, sensible thoughts, but they often simply push the decision further into a future that keeps moving away. Confidence, in most cases, is not something that arrives before action. It is something built through action, brick by brick, attempt by attempt. What makes fear especially difficult to notice at this stage is that it rarely uses the language of fear at all. It borrows the language of practicality instead. It says, "Now isn't the right time," or "I should focus on more important things first," or "I'll do it once I feel more prepared." These sentences sound wise. They sound responsible, and sometimes they genuinely are. But often, underneath the reasonable-sounding words, the real engine driving the decision is simply avoidance, dressed up as patience. A person can spend years, even decades, waiting for a feeling of readiness that was never designed to arrive on its own, because readiness is usually a product of action, not a precondition for it. Learning to pause and ask honestly, is this real caution, or is this fear wearing caution's clothing, is one of the more uncomfortable but genuinely useful questions a person can practice asking themselves on a regular basis. Something similar happens on a larger scale. Quietly, over years, a person may look completely free from the outside, going to work, meeting friends, living what appears to be a full life, while privately avoiding an entire category of choices without ever having consciously decided to. They simply never apply for the harder role. They simply never speak up in the important meeting. They simply never sign up for the class they have wanted to take for years. No single decision felt dramatic enough to notice. But added together, these small, repeated avoidances quietly draw a boundary around a life, a boundary that was never actually necessary, built one comfortable choice at a time. Imagine two roads at a crossing. One road is familiar and comfortable, and fear strongly prefers this road because comfort feels safe in the short term. The other road is uncertain and demands courage, but it is almost always the road where real growth actually lives. Fear will keep pointing you toward the comfortable road, not because it is the better choice, but because comfort is the only thing fear knows how to protect. A useful daily habit is to replace one question with another. Instead of asking, "How do I stay safe right now?" ask, "How do I grow from this moment?" Instead of asking, "What would fear have me avoid?" ask, "What would courage have me try?" These small daily choices accumulate. Courage is rarely built through one dramatic leap. It is built the same way a habit is built, through many small decisions repeated over time until they feel natural. Think about compound interest, the way a small amount of money, left untouched and allowed to grow steadily, eventually becomes something far larger than the original amount ever suggested it could. Courage compounds in exactly the same quiet way. One difficult conversation handled well does not feel life-changing on its own, but 10 of them, spread across a year, begin reshaping how a person sees their own capability. 100 of them, spread across several years, can produce a person who looks, from the outside, almost unrecognizably braver than they once were. None of it happened in a single leap. It happened through consistent, unglamorous repetition, the same way any meaningful skill is built. Consider also what fear avoidance actually costs over a lifetime, not just in missed opportunities, but in missed information. Every situation you avoid because of fear is also a situation you never get real data about. You never learn what actually would have happened, so the fear stays exactly as large and unexamined as it was the day you first avoided it. Meanwhile, every situation you walk into despite fear gives you real information, real evidence, whether the outcome was good or difficult. That evidence becomes the foundation the next decision can stand on, which is precisely why people who take more chances tend to become less afraid over time, not because they were born braver, but because they simply gathered more real evidence to replace their imagined fears with. Lesson 6. Move forward while fear is still there. If there is only one idea to remember from everything shared today, let it be this one. You do not need to wait for fear to disappear before you act. In most cases, fear only begins to fade after action has already started, not before. Think about the first time you did something genuinely difficult, whether it was a first interview, a first public conversation, or the first time speaking English aloud to a stranger. Before it happened, the fear likely felt enormous. Afterward, most people discover the same surprising truth. They survived it, and it was rarely as severe as their imagination had predicted. The gap between the imagined fear and the lived experience is almost always wider than expected. Courage was never about the absence of fear. It has always been about action taken while fear is still present in the room. A person who waits for fear to vanish completely before beginning anything may end up waiting an entire lifetime, because for many meaningful goals, fear simply does not leave first. It leaves after you move. Think about someone who works in emergency response, walking toward a genuinely dangerous situation, while everyone else instinctively moves away from it. It would be a mistake to assume this person feels nothing. Their heart is very likely pounding just as hard as anyone else's would in that moment. What separates them is not a missing fear response, but a stronger competing signal, a sense of purpose, training, and responsibility that outweighs the fear without erasing it. Most days will never ask this much of you, but the underlying lesson still applies at a much smaller scale. You do not need to eliminate fear to act with purpose. You only need something that matters to you more than the discomfort does. Every attempt, even the imperfect ones, teaches the mind something valuable, that discomfort is survivable, that mistakes are not permanent, that the shadow was indeed larger than the object casting it. Each small act of courage becomes evidence your mind can use the next time fear tries to convince you to stay still. Think about learning to ride a bicycle for the first time. No one becomes stable on two wheels by reading about balance, or by waiting until falling feels impossible. Balance arrives through actually pedaling forward while wobbling, while uncertain, sometimes while genuinely afraid of falling. The wobbling is not a sign that something is wrong. It is simply part of the process that eventually produces steadiness. Speaking a new language works the same way. Changing careers works the same way. Starting anything meaningful works the same way. The wobble is not the enemy of progress. It is the price of progress, paid in advance. There is one more thing worth saying clearly before we close. None of this means fear will one day vanish completely and never return. It will return, again and again, in new forms, attached to new goals, throughout your entire life. That is not failure. That is simply how growth continues to work for every person who keeps choosing to grow. The goal was never to reach a fearless future. The goal is to become someone who can feel fear clearly, name it honestly, and still choose the next step forward anyway. So here is the takeaway to carry with you after this video ends. Fear will keep showing up. That part is not likely to change. What can change is your relationship with it. See it clearly as a shadow rather than a solid wall. Stop feeding it with unnecessary attention. Question the story it tells you. Remember that you are not the fear you feel. Refuse to let it quietly design your entire life. And most importantly, take the next step while it is still standing beside you. Before you go, take a moment to think about one specific thing fear has been quietly keeping you from doing. Not something vague, something specific, with a name, with a shape. A message you have been meaning to send. A class you have been meaning to join. A sentence in English you have been meaning to say out loud but keep swallowing at the last second. Whatever it is, it has almost certainly been standing there, far longer than it needed to, disguised as something larger and more dangerous than it actually is. Today would be a good day to look directly at it and take just one small step, not the whole journey, simply one step in its direction. If this video resonated with you, come join our community at WisdomLoom English. We explore ideas exactly like this one every single week. Real lessons that help you grow, speak, and live with more courage. Hit subscribe now so you never miss the next one, and I will see you in the next video.